The views expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect the views of this station. Proper advice depends on a complete analysis of all facts and circumstances. Listeners should consult their own financial advisors or conduct their own due diligence before making any financial decisions. Securities offered through Western International Securities Incorporated. Member FINRA SIPC. This is Financial Myth-Busting with Don Bennett, where politics and the economy intersect.
And this is Don Bennett. We're live on a somewhat okay, beautiful day in Washington, D.C. We're actually expecting a lot of snow today, so we'll see if that comes or not. Maybe one of those, yes, it's going to snow, but it never does snow type of moments like we had last week in New York. But, you know, we have a really great show today. We've got two amazing guests. At the bottom of the hour, we're going to have Mark Thronton in, and he's going to be talking about the last currency standing. And he's a senior fellow at Mises Institute, as well as at the bottom of the hour, we're going to have Michelle Minton. And we're going to be talking about criminalizing Super Bowl Sunday. We're going to be talking about the ban on gambling, sports gambling. And, you know, I even have a question to the audience about that. I really think it's kind of amazing that we even have our government focusing on something like that when it's just somebody's vice. I don't believe in vice taxes at all. But again, if you have any questions about that or anything in your portfolio, give me a call. I'm live today, and I'm at 1-855-884-DAWN. And again, if you want to become a fan of Financial Myth-Busting or ask me a question through Facebook, all you need to do is like us on Facebook at Financial Myth-Busting, or ask me a question on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter at Don Bennett FNB on Twitter. And you can also contact me via the email at Don Bennett or BennettGroupFinancial.com. And all you need to do is click on the Contact Us in the upper right-hand corner of the page. And we'll answer you in this show or an up-and-coming show, or I will actually personally call you next week to make sure you get an answer to your question. That's how important we think you are. But before I jump into what I saw last week in the markets, which was extraordinary, I do want to talk about gambling. You know, today's Super Bowl Sunday, and the stats show that almost half of Americans actually bet on this big game. Yet the United States government actually outlaws making any bets online, where most sports betting actually takes place. And that means people actually end up using websites based offshore, by the way. So I want to know what you guys are thinking about. Now, back in October, or November actually, 2014, NBA Commissioner Adam Silver had already gone on record as a supporter of legalized gambling. And he even went so far as to say sports betting is inevitable as cash-strapped states look for ways to generate revenue. I agree. And although the NBA was opposed to recent legislation in New Jersey that would essentially legalize sports betting, or rather not enforcing existing laws, this Adam Silver, and again, he's the NBA commissioner, he actually remains a proponent of legalization. So I'm going to ask you this question. Do you gamble? Are you going to put money on tonight's game? And do you think Americans should be allowed to bet on sports? Give me a call at 1-855-884-DAWN. And again, that's 1-855-884-3296. Now, Adam Silver also penned a New York Times op-ed back in 2014. Again, it was November. And he did say two things that I want to read to you. He said there's an obvious appetite among sports fans for a safe and legal way to wager on professional sporting events. Mainstream media outlets regularly publish sports betting lines and point spreads to do it. Then he went on to say, outside of the United States, sports betting and other forms of gambling are popular, widely legal, and subject to some regulation. In England, for example, a sports bet can be placed on a smartphone at a stadium kiosk or even using a television remote control. Pretty cool. So in light of these domestic and global trends, the laws on sports betting should be changed here in the United States. I actually agree with that. I think Congress should adopt a federal framework that actually allows the states to authorize betting on professional sports, and then they can actually just focus on the technological safeguards of how to get that done. So I'm going to ask the question again, should sport betting be legalized? I want to hear from you. I'm at 1-855-884-DAWN. Again, that's 1-855-884-3296. And I have to say, the thing about gambling is that, you know, honestly, the more you gamble, certainly the more you're going to lose because the odds are always going to be against you. But there will be these moments that you win. because everybody wins sometimes. But to me, this is no different than buying the occasional scratch-off lottery ticket, which is why, despite the United States government outlawing online betting, the government, which I think is weird, also condones gambling in forms of lotteries and select casinos. So do you think the government is just trying to protect its own gambling operation by outlawing competitors? That's my big question. I want to hear from you. Again, I'm at 1-855-884-DAWN. Again, that's 1-855-884-3296. And while I'm waiting to hear from you, I'm going to just talk about what I got this overwhelming feeling last week that I was asking the question is, what actually is reality anymore? I mean, when you watch these markets trade up 250 points and then they're down within 30 minutes, down to negative 70, then they're up 184. It's just, what is reality anymore? And this is every single day on the market. It's just psychotic. But there was this letter that actually got me straight. And the letter actually was an open letter to the Germans from Greece. And a letter, by the way, that I wish that was written by our own Federal Reserve almost 7 years ago to the GMs and the AIGs of this world instead of bailing them out. But we didn't do anything like that. But before I jump into that, I want to say, back to these markets, I just think it's so odd nowadays when I see Americans trying to wrap their minds around our duplicitous government and this economic mess of make-believe, especially when they try to pass it off as being real, as being logical. Even with the U.S. equity markets, which are down, I think about approximately $1.1 trillion since its peak on December 29th of 2014. And this Friday, with the failed end-of-the-month lift that we typically get, we've been getting for the last 3 or 4 years, I guess the Fed's plunge protection team or whoever they hire to make sure that the market closes on a positive note, it didn't work. So it's not going to help the month-end results. And still, investors, the media, the White House are not acknowledging the truth that all the quantitative easing that was implemented in the last 6 years by all those well-intentioned decision makers has actually left us with very little. And so it reminded me of the German philosopher and cultural critic, Friedrich Nietzsche. And he said, sometimes people don't want to hear the truth because they don't want their illusions destroyed, unquote. I, as a money manager and a wealth manager, actually have observed the same thing throughout my career where men and women are always trying to justify things by way of some twisted interpretation of what was presented to them as the truth. I mean, by other financial advisors, by people in my industry, by analysts, by the news media, by the White House, even Congress. Bottom line, I just don't believe that many people want to hear the truth. And it reminds me, of course, of that movie, A Few Good Men. Remember that when Jack Nicholson's character screams, "You want the truth? You can't handle the truth." And at the end of the day, truth is merely defined by what the standards of wrongdoing is today. Most individuals worldwide aren't saints. I'm not a saint. Most of you guys aren't saints, least of all those in our government ranks. Yet I believe there is an exception, and that the people in the U.S. and the worldwide now want honesty. They want truth to become the new standard of those in power. So for the first time in a very, very long time, I do believe we are all ready to handle it, quote unquote, and that accepting the good with the bad will no longer be a trade-off. And so to that point, again, back to, where is reality anymore? Last week, Citibank analyst Matt King came out and warned us that central banks, while central banks' grip on the economy seems to be waning, the question now becomes whether the central banks are actually going to be willing to keep pumping in liquidity when the economic benefits are not showing up. And if they don't, well, then 2015 is actually going to be a year of shattered economics, shattered social system, and shattered political illusions. And the central bank's goal to stave off, this visible effects of the developed economy's crisis is now actually beginning to fail, which is what I think we saw in January. And the holes are becoming much, much more apparent. I mean, the moment our very own Federal Reserve stopped the quantitative easing, the pricing of equities in the U.S. began to see a great deal of volatility. Even oil dropped in value. So I would think by now it should be crystal clear to everyone that our market fundamentals have been obscured by manipulation, central bank manipulation to be exact. And I have to say, it's hard to guess what kind of black swan actually is going to show up to wake up the rest of the investors out there that haven't figured this out. But when it does, it's actually going to take place with considerable geopolitical turmoil. I think absolutely. And I think, quite frankly, last week, which is why I talked about a letter, that moment actually arrived via Greece, and with its new prime minister, Alexis Tsipras, who represents Greece's anti-austerity party, Syriza. And he wrote this open letter to Germany and to the ECB stating that the loans to Greece will never be repaid, and even calling German fiscal policies, quote unquote, fiscal waterboarding. Can you believe this? And yeah, that wasn't actually the only thing Tsipras said. So I want to read some excerpts from his letter because it's honest and it's true. You know, initially, I was saying to a number of people, I couldn't figure out why George Soros was actually backing this guy, but now I'm starting to get it. So again, this is the first excerpt I wanted to read to you. It says, in 2010, the Greek state ceased to be able to service its debt. Unfortunately, European officials decided to pretend that this problem would be overcome by means of the largest loan in history on the condition of fiscal austerity that would, with mathematical precision, shrink the national income from which both new and old loans must be paid. An insolvency problem was thus dealt with as if it were a case of illiquidity. Can you believe he said that? Now, this is true. This is the truth. And there's more. And he's just basically telling the Germans and the ECB the way it is. He went on to say, indeed, even before a full year has gone by, from 2011 onwards, our predictions were confirmed. The combination of gigantic new loans and stringent government spending cuts that depressed incomes not only failed to rein the debt in, but also punished the weakest of citizens, turning people who had hither been living a measured, modest life into paupers and beggars, denying them from all their dignity. The collapse of incomes pushed thousands of firms into bankruptcy, boosting the power of surviving larger firms. Thus, prices have been falling, but more slowly than wages and salaries. This is important. Again, you've got to get this letter. In the setting, the deficit of hope accelerated uncontrollably, and before we knew it, the serpent's egg was hatched, he said, the result being neo-Nazi patrolling our neighborhoods, spreading their message of hatred. So despite the evident failure of the extent he calls the extend and pretend logic, it is still being implemented to this day. The second Greek bailout, enacted in the spring of 2012, added another huge loan on the weakened shoulders of the taxpayers. So he's going on by saying, hey, basically listen to this. This isn't an unreasonable thing. He's actually correct. You can't cure a debt problem with more debt. And if you think that is true, then that's just madness. It's sheer madness. But it also means this letter isn't the work of an economic madman. And as much as I disagree with a number of Syriza's economic views, there's not a single thing in this open letter that I can find fault with. And that's something that I want us, again, to continue to talk about, because all he's coming back and saying is that the math doesn't work. He's got it right. As a matter of fact, it follows a very simple economic truism that what cannot be paid back won't be paid back. And it doesn't mean that he said that they didn't want to. They just do not have the ability to pay it back. It won't happen. And he wanted to tell the Greeks before they found out the wrong way, or, at the end. Again, I just have to say this now. I think it's really going to be hard for the ECB to put this genie back into the bottle. It's causing a lot of the other countries, Spain and Portugal, to almost feel the same way because they can't pay back their debt either. So again, is this the beginning of, frightening honesty? Is this the beginning of truth? And are we going to start to see it here in the United States? And when we come back to break, we're going to be talking about that, as well as, again, we're going to be talking about gambling because it is Super Bowl Sunday, and I want to know what you think. Should sports gambling be legal? Give me a call at 1-855-884-DAWN. Again, that's 1-855-884-3296. Today's Super Bowl Sunday, and the stats out there show that almost half of Americans are betting on this big game. Yet the United States government, actually outlaws making any of these bets online, where most sports betting actually takes place. So I want to know, do you gamble? Are you going to put money down on tonight's game? And should sports betting be legalized? Give me a call at 1-855-884-DAWN. Again, that's 1-855-884-3296. You know, me personally, I don't believe in gambling in any form or fashion. But I love the Super Bowl because I love football, and I love the parties, and I love the food. But as a society, Super Bowl Sunday is America's biggest sports betting day of the year. And if this year's legal betting action is similar to last year's, there's actually going to be about 100 million bets being put together all around this NFL's championship football game. But that pales, however, to the expected $3.8 billion that's actually going to be wagered illegally, according to American Gaming Association. Sports betting is illegal here in the United States. But I'm wondering, is it also socially acceptable at the same time? I'd love to get your insight on that because, you know, what do you think? Is gambling just a basic allure to people, or is it something that we should take a really second look at? You know, the big picture, this traditionally has caused concern with the NFL and the NBA and the MLB and the NHL and the NCAA. But, you know, none of these entities actually wish that sports gambling should go away. You know, it helps the popularity of their game. But there's also this fear that a player or coach or official could be at risk if he develops a gambling problem, I guess. Again, this is about people's vices and their weaknesses. You know, that's why Pete Rose isn't in the Baseball Hall of Fame, or why even rumors persisted about the real reason Michael Jordan suddenly decided to play minor league baseball, and why all the leagues shuddered at the mention of the former NBA ref, Tim Donaghy, who was sentenced to 15 months in federal prison camp for taking money from a professional gambler in exchange for tips on a game he refereed. I mean, this type of stuff has been going on, but of course everybody's been penalized for it. So I'm asking the question again, does gambling allow people to escape their lives? I mean, Americans will illegally wager 38 times more money on this year's Super Bowl than they will legally in Nevada. And that's the only state that has full-fledged sports betting ability. This is all according to a projection that came out of a casino industry trade group. And so American Gaming Association President Jeff Freeman actually told a gathering of mayors in Washington, D.C. last Thursday that his organization expects that the Super Bowl is going to elicit, again, about $3.8 billion in illegal wagers compared with Nevada's legal $100 million they're expecting. And Freeman says that the estimate of those illegal bets was at first for his organization, but again, he's saying that he really does believe that that's actually going to be the situation. So betting on the big game is a huge industry that keeps on growing, and this is the first ever estimate. Comes at a time when Americans' attitudes towards regulated gaming continue to improve, and that the AGA is closely examining the current state of sports betting, which is good, that the laws governing it. But, you know, I think that I wanted to continue to further explore this topic with each one of you. So imagine for a moment that Las Vegas-style sports wagering was actually legal in other states. Maybe the NFL's negative attitude towards betting would actually be relaxed. You know, that way strip casinos could actually advertise their Sunday events as Super Bowl parties rather than hiding behind the term big game out of fear of trademark lawsuits by NFL attorneys. You know, all the hoopla and festivities surrounding the Super Bowl wouldn't be heightened anymore. I mean, wagering aside, Sunday's game between the defending champion, the Seahawks, and the Patriots actually sells itself. But, you know, again, it's just time to rethink it. I mean, in general, I think this is the good question is, what do you think about all this? And also, what do you think about sin taxes in general? Is it right for the government to profit off of our vices? Shouldn't we actually make money off of them too? We all know taxes on cigarettes and booze are done ostensibly to curtail these habits, so they say. Yet, you know, again, it's also undeniable that the government actually needs people to engage in these vices to maintain its revenue. So do you find all of this hypocritical like I do? Give me a call at 1-855-884-DAWN. Again, that's 1-855-884-3296. And remember, we're going to be going into break here shortly, and I want you to stay tuned for Mark Thronton because he's going to be talking about the last currency standing and why Janet Yellen's only bluffing about raising rates, which is what she did this past week, and why Americans need to pay closer attention to the recent election in Greece, which is why I'm talking about it. It's really a lot to take in, but these are important sea changes that are occurring this week that's not only going to affect your life, it's going to be affecting your portfolio. Again, do want your opinion on gambling. Is it a smart thing for people to do with their money? I don't know. That's up to you.
The views expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect the views of this station. Proper advice depends on a complete analysis of all facts and circumstances. Listeners should consult their own financial advisors or conduct their own due diligence before making any financial decisions. Securities offered through Western International Securities Incorporated. Member FINRA SIPC. This is Financial Myth-Busting with Don Bennett, where politics and the economy intersect.
And Mark Thronton is here. Mark is a senior fellow at the Mises Institute and also serves as the book review editor of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. In a recent article titled Federal Reserve to Keep Interest Rates Stable Despite Strong Economy that came out in the Daily Caller, this was on January 28th of 2015 of last week, Thornton called the interest rate freeze deceiving, and this is where I want to start today. Mark, welcome to Financial Myth-Busting.
Good morning, Dawn. It's great to be on your program. Early Sunday morning. Great to be here.
Good. Hey, listen, this week Janet Yellen said that despite improving employment, that she would not be increasing interest rates. So previously that had been the primary metric for when rates would eventually rise. Are we now just keeping rates low specifically to drive up inflation?
Oh, yes. I mean, we've had 7 years of near 0% interest rates from the Fed. We've had one dose of quantitative easing after another. They've been telling us for quite some time now that they were going to normalize interest rates, that the Fed was going to raise interest rates, and that we would get back to normal where you could put money in a bank and earn interest on your deposits.
Right.
And this is the story that's been going on. And now they say, well, things aren't very good. They're not as good as we thought they would be. Things are bad overseas. Our exports are declining. And so what they're telling us basically, Dawn, is that unless we get global perfection in the economy, they're not going to raise interest rates.
So they've moved their benchmark. But so here's the thing: 16% of global government bonds now have a negative yield. Is the United States going to fall into that trap?
Well, we're heading for it. There's no question about that. The U.S. government bonds have been rising in price and falling in yield or interest, and we're at an all-time record low in terms of the interest rates on the 10-year and 30-year bonds. So we're certainly heading in that direction, and we're going to go probably further in that direction, Dawn, because Europeans are buying our government bonds because of, they're getting zero
right.
or negative rates.
Right. But, if that's the case, and all of a sudden Janet Yellen says they're not going to raise rates, where is all this euphoria coming about, saying that we have a strong economic environment here? Where's it coming from?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it's because we're the least worst dog in the hunt, basically, right now. Japan is in recession. China and India are contracting. Russia and Europe are in recession. Brazil and Canada are contracting. The U.S. is one of the few economies that's actually one of the few large economies that's actually continuing to grow. And, of course, the U.S. dollar is the world's biggest reserve currency. And so I think what you're seeing right now, the reality is that people are fearful and they're in flight to the U.S., and this has been going on, to the dollar, to the U.S. stock market, to the U.S. government bonds. But I think that 2015, you're going to see that people are even fearful of U.S. stocks.
Well, but the dollar, though, has been crushing any type of recovery dream. I mean, right now, the fourth quarter earnings per share, it's tracking 7% below consensus, estimate at the start of the reporting season. So I even know that I think 87% of the companies have actually guided below consensus expectations for next quarter. I mean, isn't that the dollar hurting them?
Yes, it's the dollar and the world economy, and the world economy is feeding into oil prices, and oil prices are feeding into oil companies, and of course, oil companies, energy companies make up a big sizable factor in terms of the consensus earnings in the stock market in the S&P 500. And so they're all paring back. They're paring back on capital expenditures, and export-related companies are seeing lower earnings and lower sales. And so, yeah, the dollar is hurting exporters in the S&P 500. There's no question about that, and it's being felt most severely in the oil and energy sectors.
But what do you think Janet Yellen's actually going to do? I mean, of course, January, we were off, I think, $1.1 trillion is my calculation from the December 29th high in the stock market. And we didn't even get a rally Friday. You know how they typically pull that off the last day of the month to make everything look better than it is? I mean, what's Janet Yellen actually going to do? I mean, can she ever raise rates knowing how it's going to impact the markets that, by the way, aren't doing well anyways?
Well, I that's what I would do, is I would just set the stock market aside and try to normalize the economy and try to put the economy back on a market basis rather than a bureaucratic central bank basis. But I don't think she's willing to do that. I don't think she's got the backbone politically any more than Ben Bernanke did. And so what I expect is that the stock market is definitely headed lower in 2015. And as the money supply growth dries up, and it's already headed in that direction, as the money supply growth rate dries up, I expect them to initiate another round of quantitative easing after the Europeans have gone through a good part of their quantitative easing program. So it seems to be circling the globe where Japan does it, China does it, the U.S. does it, Europe does it, and then it's back to Japan and then back to the U.S. Everybody pushing on the monetary engine of inflation, of credit, of quantitative easing. I think that's what we're headed for sometime later in 2015.
So you're saying if everybody raises rates, that's actually the possible path back to normalcy? Is that what you're saying?
I think that's what they should do. I think everybody should do what the Swiss does, what the Swiss National Bank did, which is basically stop with the pegs, stop with the zero interest rates, stop with the quantitative easing, and allow money markets to exist again, which they don't really exist in the current context because of these zero interest rates policies.
So in recent weeks, practically every major currency has severely depreciated. The yen, the ruble, the Canadian dollar, the Mexican peso, the Brazilian real, the euro. Yet the dollar somehow survives. So, one, how do you think that's happening? If you could give me your best guess. And then also, isn't it just a matter of time before we suffer the same fate?
I'm afraid so. But I mean, in the short term, in the last several months, basically what we've seen is Europeans, Japanese, Chinese, Brazilians, knowing that their currencies are headed lower, they're turning their currencies into U.S. dollars. And so it's a flight to safety, it's a flight to stability, it's a flight to the best, or at least the least worst currency in the world. And of course, Dawn, you also know that remarkably, with these higher dollars, that gold prices in terms of dollars has not only stabilized, but headed higher.
Well, I mean, so I think you've seen that in the gold prices, right? They've converted their unbacked make-believe, soon-to-be worth a lot less paper money into something tangible. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why gold's been bidding up, in particular with the euro.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I couldn't have said it better myself. Gold and silver prices, the gold and silver miner stock prices have all stabilized when everybody was expecting them to collapse. With the fact that commodity prices, energy prices are collapsing, and yet gold and silver stabilized and headed higher in terms of dollars. So that's remarkable, and I think it tells us a great deal about the global economy as it exists entering 2015.
I want to talk a little bit about Greece because the open letter to Germany and to the ECB was surprising in a good way for me. So as just to remind all the listeners out there, this week in Greece, the voters actually elected a new government that promises to undo reforms imposed by the EU, namely austerity. So do you think this is actually going to work?
Well, I think it's going to happen. The Greeks invented democracy, and they perfected the art of using the right to vote themselves as much benefits as possible and to impose as much costs on foreigners and outsiders. And they've been doing this for decades and decades. In their entry into the euro and the eurozone is not a detour from their past history or their politics. They're experts at doing this kind of thing, and they're going to default on part of their obligations.
Yeah.
They're going to default on austerity to a certain degree, and they're going to require that the EU renegotiate the bailout loans as well as other loans, and they are in a very good position because not only do we have these economic problems, we also have the problems of the crisis with Russia and the Ukraine, and the fact that the EU wants to use more measures, more sanctions against Russia, and Greece has a veto power over all of that. So I would, despite Germany's outburst of demanding that the Greeks get in line with Germany and the Europeans, I would say that the Greeks are really in the driver's seat here and expect them to maybe not be dictating the terms of how things are going to be moving forward, but just to know that they're in a very good bargaining situation with respect to the Russian situation and with respect to the loans and the bailouts and austerity.
So you think this open letter to Germany and the ECB, do you think it's actually going to work?
Well, I think it's going to work to a certain extent. And the fact that the European Central Bank has put forth this quantitative easing program at the same time, I think indicates to me that the Europeans are putting themselves in a position to be able to accept some kind of additional bailout or buy down on the bailout money that the Greeks have received and that they are supposed to pay back. But I think everybody who's in the know doesn't expect the Greeks to pay back 100% on the dollar.
But if they don't pay it back, then Portugal won't have to pay it back, then Spain won't have to pay it back. I mean, there's going to be a lot of default going on.
Yes, and as soon as Spain and Portugal and maybe others see that the EU isn't in a great bargaining position and that their banks are very fragile as well, expect that there's going to have to be write-downs. We live in a world where obligations no longer matter,
right,
and where directives no longer matter. There's no rules of the game anymore, the way the central banks have been playing this, and so expect a lot of turmoil going forward in 2015. Hopefully, though, by the end of 2015, a lot of this stuff will be resolved and will be in a more reform-minded mindset worldwide, and that a lot of these uncertainties that are facing us for sure will be resolved one way or the other.
Although the resolution might be chaos and social chaos and, a lot of political issues. What do you think this actually means for the EU itself? I mean, and specifically the euro. If the EU can't actually enforce its rules, why should anybody even trust the currency anymore?
Well, Austrian economists, and that's what the Mises Institute is all about, is Austrian economics. We've been arguing that the euro is an irrational currency, even on the basis of a fiat currency by law, paper money. The euro doesn't make any sense because you have a unified currency, but a very ununited fiscal situation. And so you have a situation that's ripe with opportunities for countries like Greece to behave financially irresponsibly and then force the others to make up the difference and to provide benefits and subsidies in order to maintain that currency. So we've been arguing all along that in the long run, the EU itself could stay united in some sense, but that the euro itself is going to have to be reformed. It's going to have to be either renegotiated or torn apart. And so, yes, there's a lot of financial chaos that's possible moving forward, but we have to move the world from this bureaucratically determined economy to one that's market determined. And the market may be, a lot lower for currencies, bonds, and stocks, maybe a lot higher for gold. Who knows? But once we get back on a market-determined basis, things will be actually much more stable than they are right now, where everything seems to be propped up from currencies to economies to financial systems to banking systems. We need to get back onto the market and get off of this centrally planned, central bank managed economy where central banks are, trying to float bond markets and trying to float stock markets and trying to get involved even in political matters and foreign policy.
Mark, by market determined, you mean free market principles?
Yeah, free market principles and
supply and demand. Yeah. And so let me ask you, this open letter to Germany, again, to the ECB, I'm just fascinated with it because I thought it was truthful. It wasn't even unreasonable. Do you think that we're going to be getting a letter like that from the Federal Reserve one of these days soon, apologizing for what they did to us? Because fiscal waterboarding is a great phrase. It feels like that we will never be able to pay off our $18 trillion in debt, ever.
Well, that's a great point, and that's the key central point in the world today. It's the question that nobody is really asking, and I thank you for bringing it up. I would love to see the Federal Reserve apologize for what they've done. They've been on this multi-year, unprecedented policy of monetary manipulation. I can't stand it. It eats my gut out, and I would love to get back to a world, even the world that existed prior to this economic crisis would be preferable to the one we're living in today, where the national debt is not even a concern for the U.S. Congress, apparently. And we're $18 trillion in debt, and we're facing, a fiscal future with Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and Obamacare that only promises to add tremendously to that. And so we've got to get off of this train because this train is going to be a train wreck. And the sooner we do that, the better. But I don't have any faith whatsoever in Janet Yellen or Ben Bernanke or Paul Krugman, who dominate the
Mark, we're actually heading into break, but I want you to hold that thought. We're going to talk more about it when we get back. And we're back. Mark Thronton is here with us, and he is the senior fellow at the Mises Institute. And we were talking about how, well, I guess we've got to get back to normalcy here in the United States. And Mark, I had this question for you. Why does it take such a long time for most people to figure out their government is actually clueless or even lying? I mean,
wow, that's another great question.
I don't know. Why is it? What is even with Americans? Do we just trust blindly?
Yes. I would say that's been our history. America's been the city on the hill, the city of light, the democracy for the world, and all great things, and John Wayne and apple pie. But more and more Americans are dropping that. More and more Americans are turning to alternative media. They're turning to the Austrian economist Ron Paul, Peter Schiff, Lou Rockwell, and so forth. They're coming to Mises.org and getting an alternative source of information. So things have been, for Austrian economists, we know this stuff, we see this stuff, we're not blind to these things, and it's been so long in coming. 7 years of this economic crisis, 6 years of the housing bubble, 30 years of mega government debt, and over 43 years of fiat currency. And so we're not blind to this stuff. But we're actually optimistic about the future because people's mindset is changing. It has been changing, and it continues to change at a very rapid rate. And so while we see, the mainstream economics, the mainstream media, having all this power and authority and ability to snooker the American public, what's actually happening now and in the last few years is that more and more Americans are waking up to all of this, and they're getting alternative sources of information, and they're changing their policy beliefs, and they don't trust the government. And the support for the U.S. Congress now is less than 10%. And so when you look at favorability, root canals have a greater rating in terms of favorability than the U.S. Congress.
How could that be? Those are horrible. How could that be? Well, one of the reasons why I think they're waking up is because every time the United States government reports the GDP or the unemployment number, I think they just know it's impossible. And so, the unemployment picture in America isn't good, or isn't as rosy as Washington wants us to believe. So why do you think they do that? And also, are they not doing their own math? I mean, even after the latest reports claim that employment dropped to 5.6%, then they tell us that the GDP in the fourth quarter of 2014 grew 2.6%. I mean, shouldn't our GDP be looking stronger if the employment picture is truly improving? I don't even believe that GDP number, but, fake numbers are fake numbers. So I can't really calculate them. I'm just trying to figure that out.
Don, they know that,
yeah.
And they know that all along, but they use statistics to mislead the American public. And, so as you point out, 5.6 unemployment, and you're in an economic recovery. GDP, even as measured by the government, should be 5.5% growth in a recovery, but it's not, of course. And we're the best in the world, or one of the best big economies in the world. And the truth is, with the unemployment rate, is that basically it's been coming down as people have no longer being considered in the workforce. They've been unemployed for so long that they're no longer looking for work, and therefore they're no longer considered in the workforce. Therefore, they drop out, and the unemployment rate falls. Okay, so that's not a good way. Typically in an economic recovery, people go into the workforce. They don't leave the workforce. And so basically we've seen the unemployment rate come down from double-digit figures to 5.6% on the basis of two things. One is that people are no longer considered in the workforce, and the other is people have been transferred from breadwinner jobs that can support a family to part-time, low-paying jobs. And so those are the two ways in which the unemployment rate has fallen, basically, and there's been absolutely no job creation in the breadwinner sector, where you're talking about full-time work, you're talking about somebody who's producing a product or a service, and somebody who's able to support a household budget rather than just an individual budget.
Mark, I want to thank you so much for being on the show. Everybody, this was Mark Thronton, and you need to actually look up some of his publications. In 2014, he came out with the Bastiat Reader. In 2010, an essay on economic theory. And in 2005, the Quotable Mises. So make sure you try to look those up. And when we get back, we're going to be talking more about Greece.
The views expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect the views of this station. Proper advice depends on a complete analysis of all facts and circumstances. Listeners should consult their own financial advisors or conduct their own due diligence before making any financial decisions. Securities offered through Western International Securities Incorporated. Member FINRA SIPC. This is Financial Myth-Busting with Don Bennett, where politics and the economy intersect.
And this is Don Bennett with Financial Myth-Busting, and we are live. And yes, this is our second hour. And, in our first hour, we were talking about gambling and sports gambling and sports betting. And as much as I don't personally think gambling is a smart thing for people to do with their money, I do know that people enjoy it. And as long as they don't have a gambling issue, some type of an addiction to it, I honestly don't think there's a downside because, this also is questioning freedom and the important principle, which I think is an important principle for us to uphold. So I am going to be talking a little bit about that with you, as well as at the bottom of the hour, we're going to have a expert guest on this talking about criminalizing Super Bowl Sunday, and it's going to be Michelle Minton, and she's going to be with us at 11:33. So you want to stay tuned for that. And she's a fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and she's going to be talking about why the U.S. government's ban on internet gambling needs to be reconsidered. And I am going to be asking you questions to help me ask her questions before I get to her. So make sure you start to run to your phone so you can actually give me your thoughts about what's going on with that. Because at the end of the day, today is Super Bowl Sunday, and the stats out there show that almost half of Americans are actually going to bet on this particular game. So I'm going to ask this question to you. Should sport betting be legalized? Do you think Americans should be allowed to bet on sports? Because actually in England, for example, sport betting is a normal thing. They can actually place a bet on a smartphone or at a stadium kiosk or even using a television remote control. But here in the United States, of course, we can't do that. So again, as much as I don't think that gambling is something for me, but gambling is gambling. And for most people, it's just a casual bet on a game just for fun. And, again, I guess some people do have compulsive problems with it. And if they do have a compulsive personality, well, certainly they shouldn't get involved in it. But, I'm wondering, is betting part of America's football tradition? And I want to hear from you. I'm at 1-855-884-DAWN. And again, that's 1-855-884-3296. As a society, it just seems to me, some people see gambling as a vice, but okay, it is. But, we always seem to be struggling with our vices here in the United States. And I just think that our governments are less morally conflicted when it comes to it, whether it's outlawing drugs or prostitution or even alcohol prohibition. Making vices illegal is problematic because it's just illogical. Vices are personal choices made that harms one body or one's own property. But it's your choice to do it to yourself. Again, we're back to the question of freedom. And so crimes, on the other hand, certainly are wrongdoing, but I don't see this as a crime. To me, vice crimes are victimless, unless, of course, you want to sit there and say we don't have control over our own body. But, I'm wondering if the federal government, they're basically penalizing people who want to gamble, especially sports gamble online, because they want a piece of the money. It's all about the money. So give me a call at 1-855-884-3296. Again, it's 1-855-884-3296. And if you have any questions and you can't get to a phone, all you need to do is email me. I'm at BennettGroupFinancial.com, or you can contact me through Facebook or Twitter. All you need to do is go to Facebook at Financial Myth-Busting or Twitter at Don Bennett FNB on Twitter, and you'll be able to get a question to me. And if I can't answer it in this show, I will call you actually next week, so make sure you put your telephone number on there. And while I'm waiting for your call, and while you're gathering your thoughts about sports betting here in the United States, I want to continue talking about what I started last hour, which is basically this amazing open letter to the Germans from Greece. And it came from their new prime minister that they elected last week. And this open letter was reasonable. It wasn't unreasonable, and it was saying all the things that should have been said a long, long time ago. And it's, and I wanted to continue. I was reading excerpts from it. And I wanted to continue to do that because I think it's important you hear it's in such a clear voice, and it's actually smart. So again, this is the new Greek prime minister, Alexis Tsipras, and this is an open letter that he put in a newspaper to Germany, primarily, and to the ECB. And he says, "Dear readers, I understand that behind your demand that our government fulfills all of its contractual obligations," now he's talking about the loans that have been made to Greece in order to help bail them out, "hides the fear," he said, that if you let us Greeks some breathing room, we shall return to our old ways, our old bad habits. I acknowledge this anxiety. Okay. However, let me say that that is not what Syriza, now that's the group that he belongs to, which they are against any type of austerity. And again, wants to strive for, he's saying, as long as these reforms do not affect their ill-gotten privileges. We are ready and willing to introduce major economic reforms for which we now are seeking a mandate to implement from the Greek electorate, naturally in collaboration with our European partners. Our task is to bring about a European New Deal within which our people can breathe, create, and live in dignity. A great opportunity for Europe is about to be born in Greece, an opportunity Europe can ill afford to miss. And what he really, the essence of all this, of course, is that he called all the loans, basically fiscal waterboarding by the Germans and the ECB, because they knew that they will never, ever be able to pay back these loans ever. And he's just coming out in front of it before they default. And basically he's saying, that they can't do it. And unfortunately, Greece has to convince other Eurozone countries to negotiate their terms. That's actually going to be coming up. So it's going to be an interesting 2015. But you've got to wonder whether this situation will actually resolve itself with calm, logical, and sensible common sense, just like this open letter. Or is it actually going to be complete chaos and wreckage? That's what I'm wondering. I mean, is Syriza the solution, this group that actually doesn't support austerity? But, if it continues to follow the logic of its prime minister in this letter that he wrote, if that's really who he is, then at the end of the day, European taxpayers won't be angry at Greece because it was their own central bank that actually developed this deal, all these loans. And you and I were probably next in line to get a letter like this from our own central bank, if they had the backbone to do it, the Federal Reserve, when they come clean that our math here in the United States with our debt load really doesn't work either, and we will never, ever, ever be able to pay back our own $18 trillion in debt. It's impossible. I don't care how you approach it, what you say, it's virtually impossible based on the way our fiscal policy is set up, based on the way our GDP is occurring, on our earnings per share with our companies. It's impossible. Oscar Wilde once said, anyone who lives within their means suffers from lack of imagination. Well, maybe the new Greek Prime Minister, Alexis Tsipras, has a lot of imagination. Or maybe he just has good, solid common sense. And so, I love his one line in there where he says, just so let me be frank, Greece's debt is currently unsustainable and will never be serviced, especially while Greece is being subjected to continuous fiscal waterboarding. And I thought that was just so strong. So I say this. Maybe that's how Greece feels today, and maybe they won't have to pay back their debt or they're going to have to renegotiate it. But other countries are going to be asking the same thing since he opened the door. And I'm wondering if maybe this is today is Greece, but tomorrow it's actually going to be the United States, and we're going to be having that same type of conversation with them because at the end of the day, we can't pay our debt here either. Nobody wants to talk about it. They just want to continue talking about when they're going to restart the printing press here in the United States, and goodness knows that's going to be horrible. So I asked this question. Why does it feel to me that America is not normal anymore? And I want to hear that from you. I'm at 1-855-884-3296. I mean, why is it that sports betting, for example, is allowed in every other country in the world, but not allowed here? Or it is allowed actually in Nevada, where that's the one state that has the right to do it. But the United States doesn't want to allow it anyplace else. Is it about vices? I don't know. I mean, I'm very conflicted about this because the government shouldn't really be involved in our lives and our personal decisions. Vices, again, are personal choices. And it's your choice to do the vice, whether you can allow it to harm your body or not. I mean, that's really your choice by how much you do. But make no mistake at all. I do think that the federal government, these benevolent entities, if that's how you want to think about them, have every interest in preventing us gambling without them getting a piece of it. I do think it's all about the money. And so, but I also think that the ultimate hypocrisy to it, I can't even talk this morning, is, actually the lottery tickets. Those Powerball tickets. The government's certainly happy to take money on that bet. And, again, make no mistake, the only reason lotteries are legal is because the government gets to wet its beak. And as long as the state offers some type of flimsy pretext about the money going to schools or senior citizens, we people are basically placated. And so I really do have a problem with that, which is why I continue to come back to the same question is, do you think Americans should be allowed to bet on sports, especially on the Super Bowl? I mean, it is something, I think almost half of Americans have some form of bet or another on this big game, which is happening today. And you got to wonder why the United States government wants to control that, but no other government in the world cares to, or they've just figured out they can get more revenue from it, so they actually allow it. Now, the pro teams and leagues, the NFL, for example, they run their own fantasy leagues, and licensed use of any NFL products, of course, is an additional revenue stream for them. But instead of watching only your team on Sunday, you're actually going to watch every game and commercial featuring your fantasy players. And this is just another way the NFL benefits massively from fantasy sports is having this fantasy league. But ultimately, I still don't think for a second that the leagues, the states, or the federal government really care about the morality of our gambling addictions. I really don't think they care. What they, again, care about is the money. When gambling is profitable to those entities and interest groups, it's legal. When someone else is making the profits, it's magically illegal. Does that make sense? I mean, standing in line for a lottery ticket in your bathrobe in the early afternoon, and that's still legal? I mean, that's really sad if they really cared about that. But, here's another layer to this ridiculous thing is, this week in Virginia, for example, and I'm in Washington, D.C., there's a SWAT team that actually raided a poker club where a bunch of middle-aged men were playing some high-stakes cards. And if anyone was playing a consensual game of chance, they actually were raided for it. These were a high-stakes game in a place called Great Falls, Virginia. And in fact, they were actually nabbed as if they were a bunch of violent criminals that were doing some harm to the citizens of the Commonwealth. I mean, and they weren't these violent thugs that were going to be ripping the very fabric of society to shreds and corrupt the populace by playing cards inside the, pricey place of an upper class home in Great Falls, Virginia. It was just really nuts. But that's the type of thing a SWAT team went in, took $150,000, returned back 60% of it, but kept 40. And what was their reasoning? It was just ridiculous. And that's the type of world, again, that we're in. And again, of course, my favorite part was that they kept 40% of it, which when they would so kindly let the players keep the rest. And these were just men playing a high-stakes game in Great Falls, Virginia, and which is a high-end area of Virginia. And, the government, of course, was sticking its hands in where they probably don't belong, I believe. I mean, why can't anybody just set up a poker game if it's private and nobody else is going to benefit from it but the men that are actually in the room, where nobody's going to get hurt from it from the men in the room? So do you think America is actually operating in a normal way? Is what I'm talking about when I talk about these stories and the things that are happening, does this feel normal? Give me a call at 1-855-884-3296, 1-855-884-3296. This is Dawn Bennett with Financial Myth-Busting, and we're back. And we're talking about legalizing sports betting. Placing a bet with your bookie at the bar is actually outlawed, not because it's intrinsically immoral. It's illegal only because the government is not taxing it and because the pro sports leagues are not getting a cut of the action. So believe me, if Apple Computer, for example, figures out a way to to fit even prostitutes with those Square credit card readers that they use now for the iPhone to automatically deduct sales tax and Social Security, well, I think that actually, in fact, we're going to be able to book we'll be able to book bets at some point. But, remember, I think it's all about the government. I've got a caller, David. Hi, David. How are you?
Yeah, just fine.
So what are you thinking?
Really enjoy your show.
Oh, good. Thanks. So should this be legal?
I believe it should, and I really don't think the government should be involved. And you were speaking about our national debt. I really don't think that the word president and that gentleman's name that's sitting in that chair should be used in the same sentence because he's destroying America. And you're right. There's no way we can repay the money he has spent, and we have nothing to show for it.
That's
a really sad thing.
It is, and most Americans, I think, are oblivious to it.
I don't think they understand. I spent 2 years in Iraq and a year in Afghanistan, and I am sitting here at home with a broken neck from Afghanistan, watching everything we've done fall apart, and it's really sad because of the people I were with that were not able to come home. Everybody's lives and all the money we've spent has just pretty much been poured down the drain, and I'm beside myself, and I really don't think that we're going to be able to dig our way out of this one. No. I think he's got us where he wants us.
Which is extremely weak and vulnerable.
Oh, it's sad. I really think that we have blinders on, and I just don't. I don't understand why the public doesn't understand that he's putting us where he's making us a dictatorship. We will be totally dependent on the government, like the countries, like Iraq, Afghanistan, Russia, China. We're going to be just like them. There'll be poor people and rich people. The middle class will disappear. And $14 trillion, I don't think people realize how much money that is.
Oh, I completely agree. Yeah, I completely agree.
Added up to the current, he spent more than all of them combined.
David, I want to thank you so much for calling us, and I also want to thank you so much for protecting our country and serving all of us overseas. And I hope you actually heal and get better. And to everybody else out there, I'm just asking: do you actually think America is operating in a normal way? When we talk about this sin tax, I just think the cost outweigh the benefits. Lobbying against sin tax is such a socially wasteful thing. We could be helping our returned military men and women recuperate faster and give them a better life when they come back after fighting for our country. There's so many other things we could be doing with this money. And quite frankly, when they do tax or even talk about, sin tax, the burden of the taxes actually fall mostly heavily on the poor. And, burdened by unfunded public pension liabilities and healthcare costs, state and local governments are in really bad shape. And so I think considering the willingness of voters to embrace new spending proposals and their general reluctancy to pay taxes to finance them is just ridiculous. I mean, alcohol, tobacco, and gambling has been taxed for a long time. A tax on whiskey, even the rebellion triggered by corn farmers in western Pennsylvania was, after all, one of Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton's first revenue enhancers. So I'm just suggesting that the sin tax, the cost of actually lobbying against it and putting money towards it, it just is such a waste of money. It's just socially wasteful, and we don't have that kind of money anymore to throw it away. So I'm going to remind all of you before we go into break, we've got Michelle Minton joining us at 11:33, and she's going to get into more detail about Super Bowl Sunday and criminalizing what I call Super Bowl Sunday because of betting, of sports betting. So you want to stay tuned for that.
The views expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect the views of this station. Proper advice depends on a complete analysis of all facts and circumstances. Listeners should consult their own financial advisors or conduct their own due diligence before making any financial decisions. Securities offered through Western International Securities Incorporated. Member FINRA SIPC. This is Financial Myth-Busting with Don Bennett, where politics and the economy intersect.
And Michelle Minton is here. Michelle is a fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is an agency that specializes in consumer policy, FDA regulation of non-pharmaceuticals, alcohol regulation, food and beverage regulation, and internet gambling. Now, Minton has also authored several studies, including topics like sin taxes and alcoholic beverage regulation. Her analysis has been published and cited by both the Wall Street Journal and the USA Today. And on October 19th, 2014, she actually wrote an article titled "Online Gambling Ban Does Nothing to Protect Consumers." And this is where I want to start today. Michelle, welcome to Financial Myth-Busting.
Thanks for having me on.
So many people bet on the NFL, but not everyone knows that technically doing so online is actually supposedly to be illegal. How is this so common if it's outlawed?
Well, part of it is the nature of the internet, just that trying to regulate websites that are based outside of the U.S. So, for example, there are 85 countries in the world that have legal online betting and legal sports betting as well online. So it's really difficult for the U.S. federal government to go after legal operations in other countries. So, people in America, the internet is worldwide. We still have access to a lot of these websites that are operating legally in their own country, but not necessarily legally here.
So, the NFL doesn't get a piece of that, and the U.S. government doesn't get a piece of that business when it's offshore. Are they doing anything to try to stop it, or are they going to try to open it up here in the United States where it will be illegal?
Well, over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not we should legalize online gambling at the federal level or at the state level, or what kinds of gambling we should legalize online or offline. So a lot of people don't know that most sports betting, online or offline, is illegal, unless you're in one of the few states that has, legalized bookies.
Like Nevada.
Yes, like Nevada, and then Montana, I believe. Montana, Delaware, and Oregon, they all had legal sports gambling before 1992, which was when the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act was passed. And that was passed at the behest of the NFL, the NBA, the major sports leagues, because they saw people spending billions of dollars a year betting illegally on their sports, and for various reasons they thought that was a bad idea, and they got the federal government to pass this law. So in most states it is illegal to gamble on sports.
But today's Super Bowl Sunday, right? So an estimated 50% of Americans I've read are actually going to be gambling in some form or fashion on the game. Is everybody an outlaw?
Well, to a certain extent, yeah. No, the American Gambling Association estimated that $3.8 billion would be wagered illegally on the Super Bowl this year. There's a huge amount of money compared to, I think it's only $100 million legally that's going to be bet on the Super Bowl in a few places where, legal bets can happen. For the most part, people who are betting in their homes, with their friends, they're doing the square pools. Those aren't violating laws, but they would have to be very careful with their state because it depends on the state law there. If you're in your house doing that kind of betting, some states like New Mexico and Pennsylvania, they do outlaw even that kind of wagering on individual sports, individual games, the outcome of games. And there have been a couple of cases in state governments going after people and people being, if it's an office pool, people being fired for engaging in that kind of activity. So people would be wise to look into their state law and be very careful about whom they're betting with.
Especially if they're a target. You've reported that some of the biggest proponents of the ban in internet gambling is actually casino moguls like Sheldon Adelson. Why would casinos actually oppose online gambling? I mean, can't they get in on the action, or do they feel like it's just being taken, that they're not going to get their cut out of it?
Well, for the most part, casinos actually do want to get into online gambling. They see it as a way to boost up failing revenue because people aren't, traveling out to Atlantic City or Las Vegas as much anymore. And they see it as a way to really reach out to the younger crowd who, internet savvy people don't necessarily want to fly out to Vegas for a week. They just want to play for maybe an hour. It really is a handful of people, Sheldon Adelson, who, some of your listeners might recognize as being one of the largest single campaign donors for the GOP. He's one of the few people who really, for various reasons, does not want online gambling to become legal. and he's put his money, his political weight behind the effort to create a federal ban on online gambling. Since states like Delaware, New Jersey, and Nevada have legalized online gambling, he really wants to stop that.
So, ostensibly, being opposed to gambling, governments, particularly on the state level, actually make a lot of money from gambling. Have states actually spoken up in one way or another about the federal imposition against online sports betting?
Oh yeah. New Jersey, for example, has been trying to sue the federal government that's just for its Sports Protection Act. They're trying to say that that's, a federal overreach, that gambling has traditionally been left to the states to determine how it's legal, where it's legal, what types of games are legal, and many states and many state governors see the federal government trying to come in and impose federal law on gambling or even overturn state law, where you have Delaware, Nevada, and Jersey already legalized it. They see that as a real affront to their sovereignty as states.
So there's another argument out there that the government has a role in trying to curb our vices, right? Tell us what to eat, tell us what not to eat, tell us when to smoke, not to smoke, when to drink, not to drink, all that stuff. Basically, our personal freedom of deciding what to do with our bodies. They want a part of the decision making in that. If everyone gambles away their money, the country would be worse off, I suppose. I mean, if everyone had an addiction and gambled away their money, our country would be worse off. How do you respond to that?
I would say, well, you're right. If everybody gambled their money away and drank themselves to death and, did drugs every day of their lives, that would be terrible for the country. Luckily, people don't behave that way. Most people don't behave that way.
Right.
The rate of gambling addiction, despite the worldwide rate of gambling addiction really hasn't been rising over the last 30 years, despite the fact that gambling has become so much more available in all of the states. You just look at Maryland, for example, or Pennsylvania, where we have casinos popping up left and right. And yet the gambling addiction rate isn't rising at all. And people, for the most part, don't drink themselves to death. It's a very small number of people who engage in either problem behavior, they have psychological problems, or addiction. I would say that, whether or not you think it's the role of the federal government or the state government to control people's vices, the simple fact is that it doesn't work. Yeah. That when you try to control vices, people just find a way around it, like you see with people betting with illegal bookies. And then what you have are people who are outside of the law and not protected. They don't have the same consumer protections as people engaging in regulated legal behavior. And that's where you run into some serious problems with, the traditional gambling bookie, I'm going to break your knees kind of stuff. If this was a legal bookie, he would be able to just say, I'm going to take you to court. I'm going to sue you.
Is betting part of America's football tradition?
I think it's part of the human tradition, just the human condition. People love to gamble, no matter what the culture is, no matter how far back in history you go. Gambling is just something that human beings seem to love to do. We are naturally inclined to analyze risk, and for whatever reason, that's fun for us.
So whenever gambling is profitable, I think, to the government or even special interest groups, they call it legal, like, lottery tickets. So don't you find that sad that, people standing in line for lottery tickets? Oh, my goodness, we lost our guest. But one of the questions I'm going to ask her is, doesn't she think it's sad that standing in line, scratching, waiting to get one of these lottery tickets, that's actually considered legal, that people are actually spending money that they don't have because they think they're going to get a big win. And although it's, whatever the odds are, 1 in a billion, it seems like that they actually will win. But, again, that is what I find very odd. As long as the government can get a piece of the money, then they care about it. Or if these special interest groups can get a piece of it, then they're going to allow it. And in fact, it shouldn't be their decision to do that. So once we get Michelle back, we'll talk more about that. I don't know if she permanently got disconnected, but again, it's just like the situation this past week in Virginia where a SWAT team actually raided a poker club, i.e. was actually a bunch of middle-aged men that were playing some high-stakes cards in their home. They every once in a while have a game like this, and it was done in a place called Great Falls, Virginia. And everyone was just playing a consensual game of chance. And but the SWAT team, of course, was sent out. It's just, you've got to ask yourself, is this really the best use of our precious dollars that we have left here in America, sending SWAT teams out with a bunch of middle-aged guys playing poker? No one was getting hurt. But there was $150,000 put on the table, and the SWAT team took 40% of it, and they gave back 60%, which I thought was pretty odd. But these weren't violent thugs, and they weren't shredding society, and they were just having a fun game. But they certainly they got pulled in and they lost their money. 40% of it actually went to the SWAT team. I mean, I do think that's odd. I mean, even the Washington Post talked about it. They said on a quiet weeknight among the stately manors of Great Falls, again, this is a high-end area, 10 men sat around a table in the basement of a private home last November playing high-stakes poker. And suddenly, these masked and heavily armed SWAT team officers from, Fairfax County Police Department burst through the door. And they pointed their assault rifles at the players and ordered them to put their hands on the table. And all the players, of course, complied. But what a surprise. Maybe this isn't your everyday cash game when you've got $150,000 sitting on the table. But, the thing is that they actually walked off. They wanted their cut. And their cut was 40% of the $150,000. So, you got to wonder what they're going to be doing with that money. And it's not even theirs, So the question is, I keep asking, is this America? Is this America operating in a normal way? I mean, if what I'm talking about feel normal to you, does it feel right, or does it feel like it's just completely off base? On the topic of poker specifically, it's a technical game. It's a game of skill. And, some people are clearly better at it than others. And actually, there are people who make a living playing poker professionally, and yet it's illegal for any U.S.-based website to cater to this demand. This is what I don't understand. So, Michelle, you're back. Is she there? Hi, Michelle, you're
hi.
back.
Yeah, sorry about that.
It's okay. One of the things I dove into is that this week a SWAT team actually raided a high-stakes poker game in Virginia. Yeah. Which was odd. They seized more than, I guess, 150,000 from the players. Of course, they took 40% of that and gave 60% back to the players. Yeah. Something's just got to be wrong with this. I mean, it's a game of skill, and clearly, like I've said this earlier, some people are better at it than others, and there's some people that actually make a living at this, playing it professionally. Why is it illegal to have this type of game in a home?
Yeah, it really depends, like I said before, on the state laws. Most states have an exemption against illegal gambling for social gaming. That's, in the house. I think the reason that this particular game ran afoul of the law was because the house was taking a rake. So the house was actually making money. And the person who was running the game claims that that money was just being used to buy food and beverage and to pay for, massage people to massage the gamblers while they were playing and stuff like that.
It's a boys' night. What do you want?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in most cases that's legal. If you have a home game and the players pool their money for chips and beer or whatever, usually that's fine. But they also had professional gamblers at this game. So that's another way that it can appear to the state as if it's not just social gaming, as this is an enterprise. When you run into trouble is when you actually have a gambling business. It's not just a social game, it's a business.
But this isn't a business. My understanding is, I grew up in Great Falls, Virginia, so I know the homes out there. They're not poor. And my understanding is that, they have this game every once in a while. It isn't like they have it every month. They don't have it every quarter. It's just every once in a while. So how could they perceive that as a business?
The sad fact is that the state perceives it as violating in some way the state's laws, and they're going to have to take, I think they were going to take it to court, but the players all accepted a plea deal, probably because it's a lot cheaper for them to just do that and to get, 60% of their money back versus going to court for years and trying to prove that the state is, taking the law out of bounds. But I think most reasonable people, even if, this was a lot of money being bet, $100,000 or more, we would just say, it's their money. They are entering into this game free will.
That's what
I think. They can leave whenever they want.
That's right.
And yes, it's a game of skill. A famous line from the movie Rounders is, there's a reason that a handful of people end up at the final table at the World Poker Tour every single year. And it's not chance, it's a game of skill. And most individuals just say, it's not the government's right to tell us how we can spend our own money. They can't spend their money. They don't spend our money, right?
Right.
Why should we let them tell us how we can spend ours? But unfortunately, this is the way that the law is. And there's a bunch of different interests trying to keep gambling limited to their business, to the Indian reservations or to Atlantic City or to Nevada or the few places where you can legally play it, so that they have control over it.
As a poker player yourself, how do these laws affect how you play?
Well, I don't play online because that's.
But would you do it if it was available?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I probably wouldn't do it very often, but yeah, if it was legally available, and it's starting to become more available as states legalize it, and credit card companies are starting to dip their toe back into processing payments related to online gambling. Yeah, I mean, it's a really fun way to spend an hour or 2 hours on the weekend if you don't want to watch a movie, you're tired of reading a book or whatever, you have nothing else to do, and then you can just shut your laptop and walk away after 2 hours. You don't have to continue playing for hours and hours on end and lose money. And most of these websites are instituting self-limitations. So you can say, I don't want to spend any more than X amount, or I don't want to play any longer than this. And then they'll shut you down if you've set those limitations for yourself. They'll say, you're done. You can't play anymore today.
How is gambling actually defined?
It depends on the state and the federal statute. Gambling can be defined is usually defined as something involving chance, betting on an event or a game of chance.
But poker, for example, I mean, there's skill there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So that isn't necessarily a game of chance.
It isn't. And that's been the subject of many court cases, of taking it to judges and saying, well, is it a game of chance or is it a game of skill? And judges have ruled, honestly, different ways on that particular issue. Some have said, yes, it's not gambling, it's not betting, it's a game of skill. And others have gone the other way. So that's why, I always say if you are engaging in a particular gambling behavior or betting, if you're playing poker in a state, you really need to, or you should, a wise person would look into the state law and sort of make sure that what they're engaging in isn't illegal.
So do you think poker is a game of skill?
Absolutely a game of skill.
Yeah, it's not a game of just luck.
I mean, there's definitely some luck involved in it. I think anybody who plays poker will tell you that you're going to have worse nights. You're going to have good nights, and some nights you're just not getting those cards. But the skill comes in that you can always fold your hands, you can always walk away from the table, and you don't always have to bet when you have a hand. So there is definitely skill involved. So
are you betting tonight? Patriots or the Seahawks?
Yeah, unfortunately, football isn't necessarily one of those things that I'm particularly interested in, so I have no stake in this game.
But betting on fantasy football is currently legal.
Oh, yeah. Even the federal laws that outlaw gambling of various kinds, they usually have carve-outs for fantasy betting. Like I said, that one, the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, that one does not have a carve-out for fantasy football or fantasy sports. But for the most part, in-house, if you have the squares and you're betting on that, for the most part, you're not going to get in trouble. But like I said, pick your friends carefully, pick who you bet with carefully, because you could run afoul of a state law.
But betting on reality football is illegal, to be clear.
Yes. If you're betting on the outcome of a single game, you may be in violation of the law.
It's so silly. Michelle, thank you so much for being on the show. And this is Dawn Bennett. We're back. And, we talked a little bit today with our guest, Mark Thronton, about currency and, what gold actually does in a currency crisis, in particular about what's going on with Europe, because the European central banks have actually acknowledged that currency that it's managing is actually being sucked into some type of deflationary vortex. And it's responded in the usual way, right? It's devalued itself. And so what European or Eurozone citizens have done, or how they've responded predictably, is actually converting their unbacked, make-believe, soon-to-be worth a lot less money, paper money, fiat currency, into something tangible. And they're bidding gold up dramatically. So you've seen gold rise. And just remember, buying gold is just buying a put against the idiocy of the political cycle. And it's really that simple. And it keeps moving up. I mean, even Larry Summers last week in Davos said we have to recognize that the era when central bank improvisation can be the world's growth strategy is coming to an end. So that's an unclear way of basically saying, at the end of the day, they can't keep propping these markets up because this is what's going to happen. So gold is moving higher. And even Bank of America last week said buy the dips in gold. And that, gold is actually consolidating. They're saying this is on a technical perspective. It's actually consolidating before its larger bull trend resumes. And they're looking for a move to 1345 and beyond. Again, this is Bank of America. Their analyst, McNeil Curry, he says he's looking for a move to 1345 an ounce and beyond. And he says right now you just see gold consolidating, but that's a nice consolidation where you've moved up over 100 points. And in fact, looks like it's probably going to end up just, breaking out of there. So you might want to continue to look for gold and silver, or hopefully you've actually got it in your portfolio or you own it straight out, which I want to remind everybody that, Bennett Group Financial Services actually got into the business of helping our listeners and our investors actually purchase gold and silver coins and bars, because we do it for much, 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 much less commission. We've heard out there that people are charging someplace between 30 and 20% in that range of commission over their purchases, and I thought that was outrageous. So my team and I put our heads together and put this together for our listeners, where your commission charges will be someplace between 1 and 2%, maybe 3% at the top, depending on the volume. But again, if you're interested in that, just give us a call at 866-286-2268. That's 866-286-2268. And if you're interested in buying gold and silver coins or bars, you can actually have it shipped to you, or we can actually help you purchase it and put it into a top-tier bank. And they store the metals for you for a fee. And again, or you can have it just delivered to your personal residence or another bank of your choosing. It's up to you. But if you're interested in that, give us a call at 866-286-2268. Again, that's 866-286-2268. And also just to remind everybody, if you have any questions regarding your portfolio, I've been a money manager for 30 years. We're defensive money managers, whereas a lot of people had a very difficult January of 2015. It was quite beautiful for our clients because we're ready for this type of correction that's going on. And we own asset classes that are considered defensive, which means they behave historically, although it's not promised or guaranteed, they behave much better during volatile markets. So they continue to appreciate. And if you're interested in any of the services that Bennett Group offers, like retirement income planning, and or investment management of any sort. We even work with estate attorneys with your estate planning and or retirement savings. And my favorite one out of all this is actually cash flow planning in today's world is, I think, is so important and so valuable to all investors as we step closer to trying to figure out how to get us to retire, even though the economy is the way it is and the world is the way it is. So again, if you have any interest in any of that, give us a call at 866-286-2268. And again, that's 866-286-2268, as well as in February. We are going to, we don't know the exact dates and times yet, but we're going to be having another steak dinner for all the listeners who would like to join us to meet me in person and to meet my staff in person. I always tell everybody that everybody on my team is way smarter than I am. I hire them that way. So they are certainly guiding this company to greatness, and it'd be great if you could meet them. They are part of this show, and they contribute every week to their ideas of what they think you should know about. So again, just stay tuned for that. Probably we'll have something a lot more solid in terms of the date and time and the location in the next show, next Sunday, so you're going to want to listen to that. Again, if you have any questions regarding your portfolio, give us a call at 866-286-2268. And you know what? That's all I've got. This is Dawn Bennett, Financial Mythbusting, where politics and the economy collide.